So hi everyone, this is my favorite day in Brooklyn. I love seeing so many people out here celebrating books. Thanks for coming. I'm going to first introduce our panelists, my fellow judges, and the three finalists who are able to come today. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the process for reading for this prize. And then we're going to turn it over to the finalists, and they're going to each talk a little bit about their books and give us a little sampling of a reading. And then hopefully there'll be some time for conversation. So first, the amazing books that are the finalists for the prize this year are Amina Gautier for The Loss of All Lost Things, Elixir Press, Mohsin Hameed for Exit West, Riverhead Books, Adam Haslett for Imagine Me Gone, Little Brown, Selah Saderstrom for Slab, Coffee House Press, Deb Olin Unferth for Wait Till You See Me Dance, Grey Wolf Press, and Dana Spiotta for Innocents and Others, Scribner. A round of applause, please. For Also, it was announced last night at the gala that Dana Spiotta is the recipient of this year's St. Francis College Literary Prize. I'd like to introduce our finalists. Deb Olin Unferth here is the author of the collection of stories Minor Robberies, the novel Vacation, and the memoir Revolution, the Year I Fell in Love and Went to Join the War, which was a finalist for the 2012 National Book Critics Circle Award. Her work has appeared in Granta, Harper's, McSweeney's, Noon, the Paris Review, and Tin House. She lives in Austin, Texas. Okay. Adam Haslett, at the end here, is the author of the short story collection You Are Not a Stranger Here, which was a Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award finalist, and the novel Union Atlantic, winner of the Lambda Literary Award and finalist for the Commonwealth Prize. His books have been translated into 18 languages, and he is the recipient of the Strauss Living Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Berlin Prize from the American Academy in Berlin, the Penn Malamud Award, and fellowships from the Guggenheim and Rockefeller Foundations. He lives in New York City. Dana Spiotta is the author of 4 novels, Innocents and Others, a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, Stone Arabia, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, Eat the Document, which was a finalist for the National Book Award, and Lightning Field. Spiotta was a Guggenheim Fellow and a Rome Prize recipient. She was awarded the 2017 John Updike Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She teaches in the Syracuse University Creative Writing Program. I'd like to now introduce my fellow jurists for the prize. Ellen Lippmann is the author of The Last Chicken in America, a finalist for the 2007 LA Times Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction, and the 2008 New York Public Library Young Lions Award, and the novel Mannequin Girl. She grew up in Moscow, Russia, where she lived until 1992. She's been awarded the 2006 Rona Jaff Foundation Writers Award, as well as fiction fellowships from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and the Fine Arts Center in Provincetown. And finally, I'd like to introduce my colleague Jeffrey Allen. Jeff Allen is the author of 2 collections of poetry, Stellar Places and Harbors and Spirits, and 3 works of fiction, the widely celebrated novel Rails Under My Back, which won the Chicago Tribune's Heartland Prize for Fiction, Song of the Shank, which was a finalist for the Penn Faulkner Award, and the story collection Holding Pattern, which won the Ernest Gaines Award for Literary Excellence. His other awards include a Whiting Writers Award, a support grant from the Creative Capital, the Chicago Public Library's 21st Century Award, a recognition for pioneering achievements in fiction from the African American Literature and Cultural Association, the 2003 Charles Angoff Award for Fiction from the Literary Review, and special citations from the Society for Midlands Authors and the Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Foundation. He has been a fellow at the Dorothy and Lewis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, a John Farrar Fellow in Fiction at the Breadloaf Writers Conference, and a Walter E. Dakins Fellow in Fiction at the Sewanee Writers Conference. So please welcome our panelists today. So the St. Francis College Literary Prize aims to bring attention to mid-career writers. Writers are eligible who have published their third, fourth, or fifth book, and the prize is given every 2 years. The thinking behind establishing this prize is that writers tend to get more attention for their first work and a lot of attention at the end of their careers, but sometimes in the middle, when writers are often at the peak of their powers and ambitions, their work sometimes gets overlooked. So this prize of $50,000, which is one of the most generous literary prizes anywhere, brings recognition to authors at this crucial stage in their career. And the aim is to provide more opportunities for these writers to focus on their craft. Previous winners of the St. Francis College Literary Prize include Alexander Hemon for Love and Obstacles in 2009, Jonathan Dee for The Privileges in 2011, David Vann for Dirt in 2013, and Maud Casey for The Man Who Walked Away in 2015. I would like to say that this year there was a record number of entries, and as in years past, the finalists are all incredibly impressive writers. Current and past finalists of the St. Francis Prize have included 2 winners of the Man Booker Prize, finalists for the National Book Award, and many other honors. So I'd now like to turn it over to Ellen, who's going to talk a little bit about the process.
So the way this worked, I think, someone maybe correct me, I think this year the contest received 187 books. The jurors received a portion of it. The first sort of screening was done by the good people at St. Francis College. They got to read everything, and they worked harder than we. So we got about 72 books of fiction, out of which 54 were novels and 18 were collections of stories. There were many of the books came from the big publishing houses, but about 20 titles came from independent presses and 5 from university presses. That's of that group of 72 books that the 3 of us got to read. It was a particular pleasure to see so many wonderful books coming from small independent presses. Some of these presses, like Coffee House Press, Grey Wolf, Melville House, Small Beer Press, Bellevue Literary Review Press, they're already fairly well known in the literary world. Others were sort of new discoveries, but they do a lot of important work, and they do often work that is much needed. For example, Open Letter Press, running out of University of Rochester, that is dedicated to publishing literary translations, or P. Poultry Press that focuses on literature from the Caribbean. It seems that even when the publishing industry might be struggling, going through a crisis, big publishing houses might be merging or getting acquired by one another. Independent presses continue to kind of soldier on and discover important voices, new voices, and give life to important books. And I think our list of finalists that we came up with kind of represent that. I want to talk a little bit about the books by the authors who couldn't be here, couldn't make it to this event from the finalist list. Amina Gautier, who is by now a master of short fiction. Her book, The Loss of All Lost Things, published by the Elixir Press, is her 3rd collection of stories. Her previous collections have been winners of Flannery O'Connor Award for short fiction, Prairie Schooner Award book prize, the USA Best Book Award in African American fiction, and many others. The stories from her collection that we read, The Loss of All Lost Things, indeed about loss, but they also about much more, about the lives of African Americans in the contemporary America, about urban poverty, about race. In his review for the New York Times of this book, Antonio Ruiz Camacho wrote that Gautier's sharp, steely stories underscore often absorbingly the collisions of race and class and the emotional trade-off of attainment. Another finalist whose book also comes from an independent press is Sela Satterstrom, a native of Mississippi and a professor of creative writing at the University of Denver. Her novel, Slab, published by the Coffee House Press, takes place in the wake of Katrina. And the slab in the title refers to the only thing that's been left of the novel's heroine's house. Known as Tiger, the heroine, she sits on the slab and tells stories of her life, relationships, and jobs. Tiger was a stripper, a performance artist, and she may be a best-selling writer who is being interviewed by Barbara Walters. Wildly inventive, the novel takes form of dramatic monologues and interviews and features serial killers, preachers, and bad boyfriends. But in the end, it is a novel about growing up as a woman in the South, the devastation of poverty and dysfunctional families, and the cultural identity of the American South, and finally, life and death. Finally, one of the finalists who couldn't be here is Moshe Hameed, whose novel Exit West is actually also happens to be longlisted for the 2017 Man Booker Prize. Set in an unnamed Middle Eastern country on the brink of civil war, it is a story of two young lovers whose romance unfolds amidst checkpoints, curfews, bomb blasts, and the loss of the loved ones. Soon they begin to hear about magical doors that can whisk people away from the war-ravaged country and into the safety. Ultimately, the lovers decide to risk everything and step through one of those doors, not quite realizing that many other doors will await them on the other side. Michiko Kakutani has praised Hameed for his spare, crystalline prose and the way he conveys the experience of living in a city under siege. He shows, Kakutani writes, how swiftly ordinary life, with all its banal rituals and routines, can morph into the defensive crouch of life in a war zone. The New Yorker added that Hameed rewrites the world as a place thoroughly, gorgeously, and permanently overrun by refugees and migrants. But still, he depicts the world as resolutely beautiful and, at its core, unchanged.
Jeff, would you like to say a few words about this award?
Yes, and I will keep it to a few words, keep it short, since we want to hear from these great writers. I simply like to say that I think it's important to have awards like this which recognize writers in their mid-career. I think there are far more awards which are granted to writers early in their career or writers who are, of course, already well known. I would also just add, and one of the great pleasures in reading the many books that we read, is that it shows how American literature and fiction has many voices and many interesting voices. So it was hard to come to a short list of 6, or we actually wanted to expand that list.
Yeah.
But right. So it was a tremendous pleasure to be involved in this, and very exciting times for our literature.
So now we've asked the finalists to tell us a little bit about their books and perhaps talk about how this book is different from their previous work, and also give us a short reading. So we'll begin with Adam Haslett.
Yeah, so thanks to St. Francis College and to all of you for all of your reading and for bringing us here. One of the things that René asked us to talk about a little bit was, because this is an award for a particular place in the sequence of books, how it's different writing this latest book. Imagine Me Gone is the one, my latest novel, how it differed in some way from previous ones. And I think for me, the main difference was a formal difference, which was that I was writing from 5 different first-person points of view. And it's a family of 5, mother and father and 3 children. And takes place over the span of about 35, 40 years. So the challenge for me was in developing a distinctive voice for each of those characters, but then also moving them across time, because the kids begin at a young age, and then by the end of the book are in their late 30s. So I had to both figure out a way to tell the story as if you're just overhearing these people talk about distinct episodes, because they're not really, there's no master narrator in the book, and figure out a way to kind of age at least the children along the way. And so that was, in a sense, liberating, because I was less concerned about plot. I was mainly concerned about the inner relationships of these people. And so that was a kind of permission, in a sense, to go in often more kind of eccentric directions. So I enjoyed writing this book, I think, more than any of the others I've written. It was harder in some ways, but there was also more enjoyment in it. I think I was reading Proust throughout the writing of the book. I'm not someone who ever writes long books, very long books. I'm never in danger of writing even 1,000-word book, 1,000-page book, let alone 3,000. But by reading that while I was writing this book, and Proust does actually play a role in, particularly for one of the characters, it was a kind of invitation myself to at no point stop writing. I was never going to write a party scene that was 100 pages long. But this was, my tendency is usually to kind of edit and cut and clip down, and that was a kind of goad in the opposite direction. So anyway, that's a few thoughts about the form of the book, and then I'm just going to read briefly the first 2 sections, which are 2 different characters, to give you just a sampling of 2 of the voices in the book. This actually chronologically occurs at what will become almost the very end of the book. The 2 brothers, the oldest brother Michael and the youngest son Alec, are in a cabin in Maine. And so the first section here is Alec, the younger brother, and then there's a very brief section of Michael. So this is the beginning of the book. Alec. As I stepped out of the cabin, whiteness blinded me. The snow-covered yard glistened under the full sun. Icicles lining the roof of the shed dripped with melt water. The fir trees, which had stood motionless and black against the gray sky, appeared alive again, green and moist in fresh light. The footprints that Michael and I had made on the snowy path were dissolving, fading into ovals on the flagstone. Beneath our tracks in the driveway, I could see gravel for the first time since we'd arrived. For weeks it had been frigid cold, but now had come this December thaw. I wasn't certain what day it was or what time, only that it had to be well afternoon already. Across the road stood the young lobsterman's truck. Brown water seeped from the icy muck caked to its undercarriage. The red tarp covering his woodpile showed through a dome of melting snow. Up the slope on the roof of his little white cape, smoke rose from the chimney into the sheer blue. I had to call my sister. I had to tell her what had happened. Hours had passed already, and still I had spoken to no one. I began walking toward the village, past the summer cottages closed up for the season, and the houses of the old retired couples with their porches glassed in and their lights on all day behind chintz curtains. In the deep cold, this walk had been silent, but now I could hear the brook as it ran down through the woods and under the road, emptying of the rocky beach. I could hear the squawk of gulls and even the trickle of water at the foot of the snowbanks. I wanted to hear Seth's voice. I wanted to hear him describe his day or simply what he had eaten for breakfast and tell me about the plans he was making for the two of us for when I returned. Then I could say to him that it would be all right now, that we could be together without interruption. But I hadn't been able to bring myself to call him either. As soon as I spoke, it would be true. I walked on, my coat unzipped, no hat or gloves, almost warm in the sun. My sister would be up by now in San Francisco riding the Muni to her office. My mother would be running errands or meeting a friend for lunch, or just out walking in this fine weather, imagining and worrying over Michael and me up here in Maine, wondering how long she should wait before calling us again. At the intersection with the main road that led down into the village, I came to the old Baptist church. The high rectangles of stained glass along its nave were lit up red and orange, as if from within. Its white clavered steeple was almost painful to look at against the brilliance of the sky. I wondered if the lobsterman and his wife came here, or if he had come here as a child with his father or his grandfather, or whether he went to church at all. The sound that he'd made chopping firewood in his driveway, it had grated on Michael, the slow rhythm of his splitting. It had brought Michael up off the couch to the dining room window to watch and mutter his curses. Why couldn't that sound do that again, I thought, in the waking dream of the moment, the unreal state of being still the only one who knew. Why couldn't that sound summon Michael once more, needle him, scrape at his ears? Why not? What kind of a person would I be if I didn't at least try to call him back? I turned around and started walking fast in the direction I had come, along the strip of road that dipped to the shoreline, up the little rise onto the higher ground, driven by the chance to begin this day over. At first, I thought my mind must be tricking me as I made the turn and saw the lobsterman, who was only a couple of years younger than I was, coming down his front yard in his Carhartt jacket and ball cap. I started jogging toward him, thinking he would disappear if I didn't make it to him in time. But instead, he halted a few yards short of his driveway and watched me approach his truck. When I reached it, I rested a hand against the tailgate, steadying myself. In the month we had been there, neither Michael nor I had spoken a word to him. He and I stood there a moment, facing each other. His arms hung straight down at his sides. His bearded face was strangely still. "Can I help you?" he asked in a slow, wary tone that made of the question a species of threat. I gestured with my head toward the cabin. "I've been staying over there." "Yeah," he said, "I've seen you two." "Come nearer," I wanted to say. I needed him close enough to hit or to fall into his arms. "Something's happened," I said aloud for the first time. "It's my brother." "Closer. Please come closer." But he didn't. He stood his ground, squinting, uncertain of himself and of me. Michael. "Hello. You reached the voicemail of Dr. Walter Benjamin. I am currently out of the office. If you are one of my patients, please leave your name, a very brief message, and your telephone number, even if you think I already have it, as it may not be handy. I will return your call as soon as possible. Please note that I am out of the office on Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays, Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, and that any messages left on those days will be returned on the following Monday. If this is an emergency and you have gone on holiday by accident with your younger brother, in the hope that you might finally tear your eyes away from the scenes you have been fixedly contemplating your entire life, but find instead that a storm blowing in from paradise has become caught in your wings, so that all you can see is the wreckage of the past piling up before you, one single catastrophe with no future, then please hang up and contact my answering service. Finally, if this is about a refill for a medication you require in order to survive, and you have some concern that your request may not reach me in time, and it seems likely that the words you are about to speak into this machine will be your last, then please know that you tried very hard indeed, and that you loved your family as deeply as you could.
Dana?
Okay, you want me to?
Yes.
I think a lot of times when I'm starting a new book, I think about I'm sort of reacting to the previous book in some way, which seems weird, where you sort of think it's not going to be this and it's not going to be that. And so I think I started with this book in sort of wanting to move away from what I had written about in the previous book. And also just this idea that you should always work against your tendencies, which when I was writing this, I realized that that's a kind of silly thing. You can't really write against your tendencies, but if you try to write against them, you get a weirder torque on the things that you've sort of, your obsessions that you've always had, maybe, if that makes any sense. So, it's sort of like accepting what your brain sort of is attracted to and what your heart's attracted to and what you're going to end up writing about in some way, but also putting yourself in a different angle to it somehow. And I think that kind of happens organically too as you're working, that push and pull between not wanting to do something you've done before and also just understanding that there's a certain things that you are always going to be drawn to, maybe. And so I guess in this book, one of the things that did seem clear was that as I was writing it, the structural elements in it, because it has a bunch of different, has essays in it, and it has kind of different characters narrating different parts. It has movies that are imaginary and movies that are real, and deciding how those, thinking about those formal things was part of the pleasure of writing this book, and that you could make meaning in the book by creating different forms that would talk to one another. So if you had an essay here and an essay there, then the reader would connect those in some way, and that would make meaning without you having to explicitly connect them in the narrative, maybe. So I got kind of excited about that, and so then when I was coming toward the end, there's some narrative strands that reach their conclusion, and then there's one sort of weird swerve that happens at the very end with a character who's not one of the main characters, and that was an interesting formal decision to make, and I knew it was going to work. But I didn't know how exactly. And when I wrote it, it was interesting to see just how, even though narratively it was sort of separate from the other parts of the book and it was a sort of unexpected thing, a lot of other parts of the book were echoed in it. And so I thought that was an interesting thing that hadn't happened before, where the end was really made me rethink what the book was about or how it was about. And there was that experience of what you are aware of consciously and what subconsciously is being connected. And that's the fun thing I think about thinking about structure and form on both the sentence level but also on these chapter levels, is that sometimes the formal problems allow you to make more intuitive connections between things as you're writing. So I think I'm just going to read that part. It's kind of like a coda, so it's not going to be a spoiler or anything, but I'm going to sort of read this little section at the end that's sort of a standalone. Can you hear me? Maybe, sort of, thank you. I guess I should have asked that before I spoke for 10 minutes. This is called The Prisoner. In the early morning, Sarah Mills kneeled in her prison cell. Sarah was not religious, but she was spiritual. What else could you be when the actual world offers so little? She prayed, but not to God. She prayed to her daughter, Crystal Lynn. She did this every morning as soon as she woke. She kneeled, closed her eyes, and pressed her palms into her closed eyes to block out all the light. She waited and then began to compose her senses. The sister told her about composition of the senses and about St. Ignatius of Loyola, a Jesuit priest who created the practice. To pray on something, you use each of your senses to create a direct experience of it. Jesuits use composition of the senses to experience the life of Christ. Sarah had her own version. She stared into her pressed eyelids, and she conjured what the house looked like. The living room with the black leather couch striped by cat scratches, the Christmas tree plugged in so the lights and tinsel sparkle. I had cooked spaghetti with red sauce from a jar and scorched the sauce when I left it on the stove, so the house already smelled of something burnt. I sat on the couch and smoked, the menthol tasting like a dry, rough mint in my throat, but the cigarette smell was so constant that it hardly smelled to me at all. I stared at the tree because the pills I had taken made the blinking bulbs linger in my eyes until I felt I was in a trance. I was fixed to the couch. I felt very good at this point. Also sitting by the tree was you, Crystal Lynn. You had wispy white hair, and you didn't like to have it combed. It was sticking straight up, wasn't it? You were sucking your pink binky and staring at the tree. You wore blue-footed pajamas with the top snap undone. There were no presents under the tree, but you loved the ornaments. I watched you in my daze. You reached your finger out and swatted a red bulb. I did nothing but stare. You giggled and swatted again, even harder, and then I said, "Look, don't touch, Crystal Lynn." The bulb swayed and spun, the lights moving in its shiny surface. You laughed, and I could hear it. Can hear it perfectly 20 years later. Next, I put you to bed. How heavy you felt when I lifted you, the weight in my arms. I carried you, and I felt wobbly on my feet. I was barefoot, and my toes gripped the carpet on the stairs. Your room was a mess. I unzipped your pajamas and checked that your diaper was dry. You squirmed as I zipped you up, and it smelled like plastic and baby powder. You cried when I put you in your crib, so I went downstairs and took a bottle of juice from the fridge. Jason came in, and I stopped as he walked over to me and put a hand on the back of my bare thigh. He moved his hand up, and I arched against him, leaned into Jason. You started to yell from upstairs. I still had the bottle in my hand, and I groaned. I did, a tired sound in the back of the throat. I went up the stairs. You stood in your crib, crying, big tears rolling down your red cheeks. I gave you the bottle. You instantly stopped crying and held the bottle with both hands as you sucked. I reached into the crib, put my hands under your arms, and picked you up. I pushed my lips to your cheek, hot and soft and a little wet from your tears. And when I pulled back, I could see you smile with the bottle's nipple in your mouth. I swung your legs back and then laid you on your back in the crib. You were so very tired, and your eyelids already started to droop. I pulled the knit blanket up. I said, "Go to sleep, baby." And I touched your cheek, felt for a second its fullness. I smelled apple juice, baby powder, and my own cigarettes. I turned out the light, and I closed the door to your room. Sarah stayed on her knees, her eyes closed, her hands pressing her eyelids. The last time I heard you, I was in the garage screaming at Jason. I heard you crying, and I wished that you would stop. I did not go to you. I was yelling, and Jason was ignoring me. I wished that everything would stop. I was sobbing, and I was in pain from my fall. My leg was red, and my thigh throbbed. I was in my panties and a t-shirt. I was shaking from cold and from the combination of drugs. My jaw was grinding in my mouth, and more than cold and sore, I felt angry. I threw a shovel at Jason's car. I threw his bike pump against his car. The last time I saw you, I was in your room and you were asleep. The smoke was burning my throat. I could feel the heat from the floor below. I stood over your crib and you looked asleep. You were not crying and my eyes and nose were watering. I could not tell if you were alive or not. I did not check, and I did not pick you up and run out of the house with you. I did not. I thought of doing it, and in the second I stood over your crib, I decided no. In the early years when she first began this exercise, Sarah used to think this litany during this part. I decided no, so you wouldn't be like me, like my mom, like all of us, a bust like I was, so you wouldn't find out about this life, that money would always be short, and without money, everything was too hard. So you wouldn't turn that perfect body into a thing to fight against, so men wouldn't hurt you, so I wouldn't hurt you. I didn't think those words, baby. I felt it in my tired body, and the only words in my head were, let her be. But then Sarah began to strip back the reasons, the story of why she thought she did what she did. Because even if it were true, it only served the self that she wanted to discard. She must simply contemplate what she did. The smoke was choking me, and I went to the window of your room and opened it. The air, the cold night air, made me want to breathe, so I pulled myself out the window. I left you in the smoky room, and I moved toward the air until I woke up on the grass with someone giving me oxygen and loading me into an ambulance. This is what I did, Crystal Lynn. Sarah stopped there. She no longer needed to add this part either. It was the wrong thing. It was a terrible, bad thing, and I am so very sorry that I did not save you. This was not her confession. This was her life in her cell alone. Sarah stayed kneeling, stayed pressing her eyes closed. Every day she did this, went over her last hours with Crystal Lynn. Every day it would come back, and every day Sarah must remember it. This was important. Sarah made herself remember, and then she could let herself go. She was on her knees, and she felt now something like forgiveness, not by God or Crystal Lynn or anyone else in the world. She felt forgiven by her own insignificance. She saw herself from the outside, on her knees in the cell, and she was gloriously insignificant. So much so that she was just air. What she wanted, what she thought, what she knew didn't matter. The repetition of the days did something to you. You knew the monotony, but you couldn't fight it. You had to invent your own repetitions to meet it, a ritual. This early, barely awake kneeling was hers. She looked deep into the back of her closed eyes, stared into the dark. When your sense of vision has very little stimulation, it invents images. Sarah doesn't know the name for this is the prisoner's cinema. It is a trick of the mind, blindness turned into glorious sight, isolation turned into hallucination. After enough time, she saw a series of lights. The false images are called phosphenes, which means show of lights. But all Sarah knew was that it gave her vibrant colors of great depth and patterns like a mosaic, like a tiled church floor, or sometimes like the spiral of a shell. These visions did not absolve her of her time, her duty, and her deeds. Instead, these visions took her through the limits of who she was and what she had done, and for this she felt gratitude, and with this, at last, consolation.
Thank you so much to the jury. It was such an honor to be among the group that finalists that I was a part of. So it's a little different with a story collection because you write them, in this particular case, I wrote them over a period of several years. And so when I was asking myself, the question was, how was it different to write this book than others that you've done? And I guess because I wrote it over so many years, that's pretty different. But also, I had, when I was first thinking about putting together this collection, it was much longer and bigger. And then I ended up cutting at least 100 pages, maybe 200 pages, or at least 150 pages out of it because I realized that I'd become such a different person in the meantime from when I started publishing those stories until now. And so I was trying to think about which story of these shows that the most. And the one that I thought of is one about a shooter called The First Full Thought of Her Life. And the plot is that there's a little girl who's walking up a dune, and there's a shooter below who has his gun trained on her. And I was just going to mention how that story came to be, which was that I had gone on a trip with my little sister and her two little girls, and we were walking up the dune, and they were walking up a sand dune, and she looked so vulnerable. You know, my little sister, she seemed so like if something happened to these children, you know, how I was just thinking about how crushed she would be. And indeed, her first child had died. And so it felt so magical and special, you know, that she would be walking up this dune so casually, you know, with these two little girls. Like, it seemed like such a happy ending. And so I wanted to represent it, so I wrote it just like that, and I gave it to my person who reads a lot from me, Ben Marcus, and he read it and he said, "This is so boring. I can't believe that this is the thing that you gave me, you know, to read after the great stuff I gave you." No, he didn't say that part, but that's how I felt, you know. And so I was like, well, I'll show him, you know. And so I was like, I'm going to put a shooter in there. So I put a shooter in there, and then, so then it was just a story of there's a shooter. Is he going to shoot her? Is he going to shoot her or not? You know, what's going to happen? And that felt very static to me because then so then all the story is just she's walking up the dune. There's a gun. What's going to happen? And I felt almost like I could predict the story, and I hate it when that happens. And so I just decided to kind of explode the story. And so I wrote it. So in the 10 minutes that it takes, you know, for this story to take place, I start going into the minds of all these different people around, and it's almost like their minds are linked because they can all talk to each other. And so the mother starts pleading on behalf of the little girl, you know, not to shoot her child, and the husband below who's holding the other the baby is like, and don't forget about this one, you know, don't shoot this one either, you know. And then like some birds are flying by overhead, and you get to hear their thoughts, and you hear, you know, the grandmother's thoughts who's in a different state. And then you start seeing all of these people who are 5 miles away, 10 miles away, some people in Florida, you know, like you start seeing all of these people and their families, and the sort of just like the minor moments that they're having in those few seconds. And then of course you go into the mind of the shooter, who is channeling the other shooters of America. He's hearing the thoughts of the other shooters who are saying, "Come on, do it," you know. And and then at the last moment, you go overhead into an airplane that's descending into this place, the nearby, whatever the airport is right nearby. Anyway, I'm not going to tell you what happens because you might actually read the book, but anyway, so that was how I exploded it, and that felt really satisfying. It felt like no one was going to see where this was going, and so I guess that was very different for me. I mean, I guess I always just try to do that in my fiction, but the particular way that I chose to disrupt it felt like kind of a breakthrough for me. And so now the novel that I've been working on, that I pray I am almost finished with, I kind of use that sort of idea, to work on the novel. So I would say that the little tiny story that I wrote in here that's, 10 pages long or whatever, 15 pages long, 20 pages long, it had a huge influence on this, 250 page novel. So, all right, so I'm just gonna read like a, let's see here. The thing is, it's hard to just take an excerpt from such a weird story, but I think I'm just gonna read the part when the mother starts chiming in. So they're climbing up. Ahem. The mother would just like to chime in at this juncture if all parties have quite finished philosophizing, if she wouldn't be interrupting anything urgent, if everyone isn't too busy. Sure. Did her husband just propose that she has an illusion of certainty? Did he just suggest she thinks she knows the world? And you, Shooter, did you assume you'd be introducing something to this family by flattening the girl out dead and bloody right before their eyes? Well, surely it'd be a shock. In fact, there'd already been a Shooter introduced to this family. There had? Her husband, shot as a child in the head. The father below, the one who's afraid of sand, he'd already been shot. Lived anyway. In the head? It had been a break-in. His mother had been unable to protect him. Picked off at 5 years old, world is full of danger. And he was fine, the husband? Fine enough. No pituitary gland. Those things don't just grow back like a tomato. To this day he had to medicate with hormones every night of his life or he'd die. Try looking that one in the face, Mr. Shooter. Well, the shooter wasn't going to go for the head, Jesus. The middle. He'd get her right in the heart. We'll see about that, Mr. Stupid. At the bottom of the dune, another family was arriving. The inside of their car like a circus, ponies and dolls, a tinkling music, glitter sprayed over the seats along with other less respectable spills. Half a mile down the road, another father had pulled to the side of the road and was saying, could they just shut up back there? Could they please, goddammit, shut up for 30 seconds while he figured out where they were? 3 miles away, a dozen families had waited so long for the boat ride that they'd descended through all the rungs of impatience available to them, and now were all nearly asleep, a collection of dazed, brightly colored bodies, possessions dropping to their sides, the smallest faces drooling. Oh, if he had any notion of the clatter of deaths and broken bodies behind this family. He thought they didn't know suffering. At 12, she'd nursed her mother through an illness that had lasted 300 days. She'd had a brother, now in a grave in a desert. She'd had another baby before these two, who hadn't made it out alive. There had been her grandmother, whom she never met, locked up at 40 and never seen again, so that her father had had a hole in them while he raised her. There were plenty of others, dead or alive but damaged. Earth is full of them, more assembling and disassembling every day. Among them, yes, this perfect little girl, but she'd been pretty unlikely considering. And the baby, don't forget, if the father might put a word in, holding her up at the edge of the lot, 1 foot in the sand, the baby who had screamed for 8 months when he was born, before settling into an intelligence not yet seen in this family and frankly a bit frightening, arranging her blocks in precise rows, sitting alone in a tiny chair with a book, reading. A civilian version of the M16, tremendous instrument, the same kind carried by F at sea, now half hidden behind the sunshade, impossible to see through the tinted glass, only the tip visible as he cracked the window, his body so tense it felt calm. And don't give her any lip about privilege. This family holds representation of nearly all the 7 categories of earthly suffering. It earned its privilege through immense striving in the face of grief the shooter will never know, and she knew this because she herself was too busy managing this striving and grief to take an afternoon out and wander the area with a weapon. Did he think she never looked around and thought, what a bunch of assholes, I'd like to take them all out? That is a particularly unoriginal thought. She had that thought at the supermarket every week. She saw a whole plane full of people having that thought on the tarmac 3 days before. She'd think it right now if she took the time to look around, but she wouldn't because she was busy, unlike stupid over here. She had other things in her mind. The idea of killing everyone around her was just one little pile of thought in her brain, off in a corner. Might get stepped on, tracked around by her shoe. Her mind was fertile with thoughts, all of them growing and twisting and filling the space, filling the sky, most of them more honorable than that. She'd take this guy on. She would.
Could you talk a little bit about how your lives are different now at this point in your career as opposed to when you first started publishing?
I just see a kind of sameness extending all the way up. I guess, how is my life different? Very hard question. I mean, I think with each, to kind of bounce off something that Dana was saying, that you do, in a way, I mean, writing a book is such a long endeavor that it takes up a portion of your life, and when you're finished with it, you're like, oh, I'm in a different place in my life than I was when I started this book. And so I feel like I kind of have to reorganize, and if not in the gross, you know, like where I'm living and who I'm spending time with, like in some sense internally, like reorganize my relationship to why I would write and what matters and what's worth spending your time on each time I start something new. So I'm now kind of in the wake of writing this one, kind of in that kind of open space. So I think probably the main difference is that before, just being more kind of naive and more future-oriented, I can kind of sense through and feel that process going on, sort of observe it a bit more, as opposed to having it just create free-floating anxiety and nothing but. So I guess that's one way I'm different. Sort of I'm more present to what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I feel a lot of what Adam's saying is true, that you are more aware of, you've sort of been through it before, so in some ways that makes you feel more comfortable about proceeding. But it does seem to get, I think it gets harder, which is not what you expect maybe. You know, I think when you're young, you sort of think like, well, you know, if I can just write that first novel, I'll have it down, and then I'll just keep writing novels. And in fact, if you're doing it right, it just gets harder and harder and harder, and which is exciting, but you also, you know how much energy it takes to write a novel because you've written it before, and you're like, wow, can I really like do that again? Go in for 4 years and just devote myself and have it take over all of my life, and then, you know, and maybe when it comes out, you know, nobody likes it or whatever. I mean, it's like a weird thing to do. It's a weird way to spend your life. But you're also sort of becoming a machine that's the only way you can function is doing that. And when you're not doing it, you don't feel like yourself. So you're sort of stuck with it now that you're in. But in a practical sense, I was waitressing for the first 2 books that I wrote at night. And now I teach in an MFA program. So that's the biggest dramatic difference is that, that you know, the writing is much talking about writing is a much bigger part of my life, and it used to be a secret part of my life. It used to be that no one else, and you never have that moment with your first novel again where nobody knows what you're doing except you. Or, I mean, at least for me, I wasn't in an MFA program, I was just a waitress. And so it felt like this little secret thing. And then once you're publishing, you're out of the closet. Everybody knows you're a writer now. And that was a different thing. And there was something very liberating about having no expectations and that freedom that you get with your first novel. But that's balanced by the fact that you don't know if you can do it. And so now you know you can do it, but you don't have that freedom of, you also have the weight of not repeating yourself and everything you've written before. So it does feel very different in a lot of ways.
Deb?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that that maybe I'm happier, like way happier, but I don't know if, I think that might have to do with just growing up. But I do know that I'm much happier than I was after my third book came out. And I think that what happened was that when after I had a memoir published, and after that, I found myself massively depressed, and I think it was partly because I realized that that having books come out doesn't change you. It doesn't change your life. It doesn't change who you are. It's whatever problems you have, you still have to, you still have them. It doesn't solve anything. Whereas I think that I had been thinking for so long, like, if I can just get this done, if I can just like do this one last thing, like, teach at a better school, or, whatever it was that I had in mind, like have a full-time position was a big thing for a long time, that then suddenly my problems would be gone, but they were not. And so I just realized, no, I have to take a completely different tact. And so what I did was, I married my boyfriend of many years. We just decided to live together no matter what. We were teaching at schools across the country from each other, and flying back and forth. And I got a dog, and we bought a house, and now we live in Austin, and it's amazing. And I sort of thought I would never write again, really, because the last book coming out made me so depressed. But then I realized, that actually it was Ethan, my editor, who just wrote and said, when's your next book? When are you gonna finish your next book? So I ended up doing it, but the thing is that that I think because now I have that basis of, like best friend / husband and, house and dog, those things that I always thought that I would never want, or those things that I thought were just, outside of my, just whatever, they just weren't a part of who I was and wanted. And now that suddenly I have them, it's amazing. Like, it's so great. Whoever could have thought that it would be so great? So now I'm really happy, and I don't know if none of those things probably would have been possible without the books, because now, part of it is due to the fact that I have this great position at the University of Texas in Austin. So yeah, I guess that's it.
Thank you. They're telling me we're out of time, but I just wanted to, I should mention that all of these books are available immediately outside the door here at the community bookstore, and the authors will be signing their books at signing station table F. Thank you again. That was great. Thanks.